The problem with Canadian whiskey is it's far too polite.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be selling good quality rye to the Americans to hype up as Whistle Pig and then charge a fortune for.
Hey, welcome to Super Social Club. I'm Jeremy.
This is Whiskey in the Six. I'm Rob.
Welcome to the Whisky Rant podcast.
So I'm a little crusty.
It's frustrating.
And it's going to be a little bit of a rant.
I don't understand it. I don't know why.
Some sort of injustice.
Anyway, end rant.
Hello and welcome back to the Whisky Rant podcast. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Rob.
And today, bringing to you some additional footage from our Ralfy podcast episode. Spent a lot of time talking with Ralfy, got some really good stuff. So we're going to bring to you guys today everything that didn't make the first cut. We're reviewing some Aaron whiskey, some stuff we didn't mention on that podcast. And Rob, interesting story how we actually got Ralfy to do this. So you want to tell our viewers how we got this legend to come on some insignificant podcast like ourselves.
Yeah, see, this is like for the Blu-ray geek, the guy that used to buy all the Blu-rays back in the day like I did, the director's cut version that you get the extra disc
right
at the end. We get to talk about the making of Ralfy on Whisky Rant.
Yeah.
So basically what happened was, I think I came to you on like, how would you feel about having Ralfy on the podcast? You're like, yeah, absolutely. So I simply just messaged him on Patreon because you and I are both a Patreon of his.
Yeah. And
he replied originally, and it was like a hectic time. Obviously, we were still in the middle of a lockdown. I messaged him on Patreon. He responded basically saying politely that he wasn't going to be able to do it. He doesn't really do those sorts of things. But I hadn't gotten back to the message to say, oh, well, thank you for replying, thank you for considering it kind of thing. So 24 hours went by from his reply, and I get a new message in my Patreon. And he probably suspected that I was upset by his response and didn't feel the need to respond to it or whatever. But he changed his mind. And one of the reasons he changed his mind is his brother, Clive, who also has a YouTube channel, convinced him to do these sorts of things because he's like, you're part of a community, whatever, you should try it out. And I guess it was enough to get Ralfy to do it. So he decided to jump on our podcast, which was awesome.
Yeah, it turned out to be amazing. And we kind of had this like unspoken relationship with Ralfy through our podcast, because I remember our very first episode we talked about the Ralfy effect and the fact that he didn't review NAS whiskeys, stuff that was he had his integrity bottlings and stuff like that, and how that affected lots of people in the whiskey community and how they purchased their whiskey. And he came up with a response video without even contacting us. We had no contact. It was just kind of indirect YouTube videos back and forth, and we determined that obviously he was watching our podcast, and he had some interest in it, and so I think it kind of worked out in that regard, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, it was definitely cool to notice that he's paying attention to what we were doing. I wonder if anybody else has made that discovery based on little Easter eggs in his videos and stuff like that. But we've noticed it a few times now, right?
Yeah. He's definitely made videos in response to what we've come up with in our rants and in our videos.
And what's interesting is in the first clip that we're going to show today, he talks about something that I think a company that he mentions paid close attention. And I don't know when we're going to be rolling that clip, but I think that's really interesting. We're getting across to a lot more people than we think.
Right. Yeah.
So,
all right. Well, we got some clips here. I guess what we'll do is we'll just kind of set up the clip, tell you what you're getting, and some of this stuff, maybe a little bit of little tidbit from the previous one, but then more kind of expansion on the thoughts. So a lot of stuff we had to cut for time, the first one. So this one will give you the full kind of uncut answers. So Ralfy, we're talking about quality to price ratio, the increase in pricing in the market, and marketing, and kind of how that plays along. And you kind of get Ralfy's kind of full opinion on how the whiskey world has kind of gone in that direction recently.
Yeah, and we should mention that we're reviewing this Ralfy approved, although it's not age stated. Aaron Sherry Cask Bodega, 55.8%. If you go on the website, they tell you that this is 9 years old. So it is a no age statement whiskey, but they tell you that what's in here is 9 years old on the website.
Yes, this is Aaron's cask strength sherry cask, a whiskey that I've reviewed before compared to the 18, and one that's recently found its way into my what's the best NAS whiskey comparison. So you can check that one out as well.
Yeah.
All right, so here's Ralfy on the first clip. As far as where Macallan has gone recently with their pricing increases, their quality, Ralfy, what can you speak to as far as what you've seen, not necessarily Macallan, but any distillery that you've definitely noticed increase in price, decrease in quality?
Right, Joe. Well, you did mention Macallan, and it's a bit more complex than all that, because Macallan still produce some basic entry level designed for drinking whiskies, which are accessibly priced compared to, say, back in the 1990s. You know, prices for the standard contemporary drinking whiskies, they haven't actually changed that much, but it depends where you are in the world because of tariffs, taxation, the cut that the distributors and importers will take. And then also at the other end, at the retailers, if they see a particular whiskey selling well or becoming fashionable and popular, they will, it's understandable, they're running a business and they will feel very tempted to pop an extra $10, $15, $20 onto the top end in the shop because they know that people are going to pay for it. But it's not as simple and straightforward as it appears. If it was to pick out an official bottling at the moment, which I feel is disappointingly bottled and not delivering in relation to the price, I would select, nothing personal, but it would be Royal Bracla, because the standard range of Royal Bracla, nice fancy bottle, but they're bottled at 40%, which is a legal minimum. Now, the legal minimum was introduced many years ago because some whiskey distillers were bottling at weaker and weaker strength, 38, 37, 35, even lower, because if they could sell the product, they'd make more profit by diluting it further. I mean, this is the whole reason that whiskey went into sealed bottles in the first place, was because of adulteration and dilution in bars, who were getting whiskey delivered in casks and then basically decanting into their own in bar decanters. So this goes a way back, so that by having an agreed legal minimum strength, it basically set a standard for having a percentage of alcohol which is bound to deliver a certain quality of flavor. And this is one reason why people go for higher strength whiskies. Once they're used to 40% whiskies, they really appreciate it 43%, which is roughly the standard for many whiskies in the US, or even better 46%, which has always been a strong point of Springbank and some of the newer distilleries like Isle of Man, for example. Great example. And we'll talk about this shortly. But with Royal Bracla, I'm getting to the stage, it's not even with Scotch whiskey, I'm looking at rums. And when I see a rum at a higher than 40% strength, I'm automatically thinking it's a better quality presentation, which it is. So I'm much more tempted to buy it, particularly if it's accompanied by an age statement, because however you want to kind of interpret that, it's something tangible to go on. It's much more identifiable. Strength alcohol, volume in the bottle, 70 centilitres or 75 centilitres, whatever. These are fixed, definitive points of reference for standards. So is an age statement. But it's when you have vague, particularly overdressed bottlings, where they're using superlatives like the finest of casks and slumbering peacefully, silently in our bespoke warehouses over the years as the dust settles and the angels waft up and down getting their share and everything's lovely and gorgeous. Basically, that's flannel. And I'll give you a really good example of that is distilleries, particularly in Scotland, who say we source the finest quality local water. Now, that's fine when they point out the stream and the burn. That's all very good, but bear in mind in a distillery, over 90% of all water used is for cooling. So they'll use it for their sparging, they'll use it for in the washbacks, and they'll use it, you know, in fermentation. But after the production of the spirit, once it's left in the casks in the warehouses, at roughly about 64% to 72%, depending on the distillery, it's only at the bottling plant that most of the water will go into that whiskey suddenly, because it's been diluted from, say, 60 or 50% down to 40%, particularly blended whiskies. And unless the bottling plant is at the distillery, like you have with Bruichladdich or Springbank, it is highly likely that the bottling plant is somewhere in the centre of Scotland, and that they're using the commercial domestic water supply, which may be additionally filtered to remove chlorine. But that's not the water that comes from the distillery. And there's something that you'll notice if you're going around Scotland, and I'm sure it's the same in Canada, is that if you're really into a good cup of tea or a cup of coffee, you will find that depending where you go, the cup will taste slightly different. This comes with experience of just tasting generally. You start to notice the regional variations in water and how it affects the flavour of beverages, just routine beverages.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that even with Coca-Cola. Drinking Coca-Cola here in Canada versus drinking it across the border in the US, completely different. It's a completely different taste. And yeah, definitely local source stuff matters hugely.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned. So yeah, that marketing, you know, we use this spring water, blah, blah, blah. Like you said.
I guess it could matter for some distilleries. Like in Canada, there's a couple newer distilleries that I believe are bottling on site as well. And they're using glacier water, and that's the big thing for their companies. Shelter Point's one of them. Two Brewers is another one of them. Two Brewers being out of the Yukon territories. So they're saying that their water is coming from the glacier near the mountain, which is near the distillery. I mean, is it a selling point? Probably, but I'm not sure how. I think in Canada the bottling happens more on distillery than elsewhere. I didn't know that about Scotland, to be honest with you. I didn't know that most of the bottling was done off-site. So that's interesting.
Majority of bottling of Scotch whisky, both blended and single malt, takes place in bottling plants. And they're all pretty big operations because there's so many distilleries around.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, certainly some independent bottlers like Berry Brothers and Adelphi have their own bottling facilities, but not all. I know, for example, North Star use the bottling hall at Whisky Broker Limited. So they're getting bottled at the borders of Scotland. So it's pretty good water because it generally is coming off the hills. It's local water, put it that way, in quite a rural, unpopulated area. And it's not so much this makes a huge difference. It's all the little differences that add up, which if we were novices, if we were occasionally buying 1 or 2 bottles of whiskey a year for birthday presents or for burn supper or New Year, whatever, or for Canada Day, you know, you're not going to even give a second thought to that. You're going to be quite entertained, and it's going to psychologically set you up to have a better experience of the product when you're reading the blurb on the box on the back of the label. But when you're an experienced whiskey drinker of whatever spirit you're into, you start to find that over time, because you're developing your own palate, and everybody's palate develops inevitably over time, you just start to find it a little bit patronizing.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly when it becomes more and more fanciful, the psychological effect is, it's almost as if they're misdirecting you away from the intrinsic quality of smell and taste, which ultimately is what we're damn well paying for.
Absolutely.
It's
Actually,
what the pounds, euros, and bucks down. That's what we're looking for, the smell and the taste, because it's what we're homing into. And I think that the industry reluctantly, now some folk in the industry are totally with it, they totally get it, but the liquor industry, not even the Scotch whisky industry, but the liquor industry generally is very traditional, and that can be for the wrong reasons as well as the right reasons.
So I love that the whiskey world is paying attention to what's being said in our podcast, what's being said by Ralfy. I don't know if he mentions this about Royal Bracla. I know that he did a review of Royal Bracla stuff way back, and he does mention that he wishes it was bottled at a higher ABV and those sorts of things. But in our podcast that day, he called out Royal Bracla for still bottling at 40%. And this is when you had brought up, the decline in quality versus price of Macallan and those types of things. Mm-hmm. And he was specific to bring up Royal Bracla. And what just happened is now Royal Bracla released a new 12-year-old. So they rebranded their new 12-year-old and they bottled it at 46%. And this just happened within the last couple of weeks. So you got to feel that they're paying attention to what Ralfy's saying and what the Whiskey Geek is saying out there, and saying, you know what, we need to start to adhere to what these people are telling us. Listen to what our fans are telling us, because otherwise we might lose those fans.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially if you are not one of the large brands where you can get yourself into those big markets and sell no matter what. When you're trying to just find your little crease in the marketplace, you do have to listen to guys like Ralfy, because they have a huge effect on people's spending habits. In this next clip, Ralfy talks about the boom and the bust in the whiskey industry, and Brora shutting down and now reopening, and really interesting take on rum in the whiskey world and kind of how that fits in, as well as really getting into talking about whiskey as an investment and speculators and people buying for the pure profitability and flipping of whiskey. What's your thought on Brora opening back up soon?
Good luck to them. It's very telling that they shut it down in the first place back in the 1980s. But it was a very different landscape. You see, in the whole whiskey industry now, there's not that many people left who remember those times. And any spirits industry around the world, it's all about boom and bust. You have your dizzying heights of prosperity and demand and prices, and then suddenly it implodes. And one reason that distilleries are charging what they charge is because they don't want the speculator getting the difference. When you let's put it into perspective. There's a rum distillery in Barbados, a good rum distillery, who have been bottling basically rum for whiskey drinkers. And they've had a series of non-sweetened, what's called the rum people would call dosing, unsweetened rums, which have been put into really good casks, fresh casks, and they have bottled it primarily for the American and European market. And it's been selling for about £70 a bottle, about 130 Canadian dollars a bottle, Foursquare.
Yep.
You've got the diadem, you've got the different names that they apply to it.
That's right.
And furthermore, Foursquare have been appearing at whiskey shows to promote their rum, which is not what rum producers do. So what's happened is that rum drinkers are latching on to the fact that whiskey drinkers are really getting into this rum. Therefore, what a great accolade that is. And so have the speculators. So what's the point in a distillery putting in all that work and taking the risk to sell a good quality rum at £70 when they go to check on the online auctions 2 weeks later and find it sold for over 3 times the price that they were charging, to which they're saying, hang about, someone's bought that bottle or a case or even more, and they've just used it as a quick flip. Now, it used to be in the old days, you'd buy an extra bottle or two, and there was a kind of gentleman's agreement that you were an enthusiast, you'd buy a few extra bottles, one to buy, to drink, one to keep, and one to share with friends, or sell on later. But it's become much more professional now.
Yeah.
It's become much more cynical. There are speculators out there who never even drink whiskey, but they're looking to buy caseloads and caseloads. And then they'll go to the auction and then they'll trigger the product that they've just bought to get the prices up, to pull in people into thinking it's an investment grade product. And then the distillers are looking on saying, hang about, our product's being manipulated. We should be the one, we produced it, we've taken the risk, we've put the work in. It's our product. We should be getting we're getting less profit than this chancer who's going for an auction flip. And I totally get where they're coming from. And when we look at the online things, which is a whole conversation in itself, if auctions, is that the stock market is perceived to be manipulated. Therefore, institutional investors with very big budgets are diversifying their risk. They're spreading the risk by buying into tangible commodities beyond the stock market, whether it be cobalt, gold, silver, Swiss watches, French vintage handbags, old motorbikes, take your pick. And of course, it includes single malt whiskey. So as much as you have a couple of hundred whiskey fans who are going to auction to spend $500 or whatever, you've got industrial speculators, you've got hedge fund-backed speculators who have got a quarterly budget of several $1 million, and they have to spend it. And this is one thing that's fueling up the particularly Macallan, old vintage Ardbegs, Highland Parks, and then, of course, right in from the back of that comes the fakers. And this is a whole can of worms that's waiting to be opened. And if you want to see what the future of whiskey is, you want to look at what happened to the wine scene in the 1990s. And there's a book that I'm going to recommend to anybody watching called The Billionaire's Vinegar. Now, I forget who wrote it, but it is a fantastic read, almost as entertaining as a Ralfy book.
Honestly, I'm loving me some rum these days. I got this Balance and Mallet Long Pond, absolutely stunning stuff. I know you didn't love it too much, but the Cadenhead's rum, I think you might want to revisit it at some point. I know you told me to just keep the bottle because you were so disgusted by it, but I want you to retry it because it's a mango bomb in my opinion.
Okay.
And then obviously Foursquare for me is leading the pack. Right. A lot of people disagree with this because it's a whiskey buyer's rum. It's made similar to a whiskey. It doesn't have that esteriness that you're going to get from the Caribbean, I shouldn't say Caribbean, but Jamaican type rums. This is not estery. It's very similar. It drinks very similar to a bourbon. It actually reminds me a lot of Cavallon Virgin Oak. Really, really good stuff. The Nobiliary or Nobiliary. But in our next clip, Ralfy talks about buying bad whiskeys, and we've all been there. You and I have experienced probably the same. Really, like I think both of our least liked whiskey is the same one, and it's that Deanston 20-year-old, just because of how skunky and almost ammonia like the flavors are in that one. And as soon as I taste that, I can't go back to whiskeys like that. So I read tasting notes avoiding that kind of stuff. So it's interesting what Ralfy has to say about that.
Yeah, I think it's important to go through drinking whiskey that you don't like. It really kind of trains your palate on to focus yourself on whiskeys that you do like. And it is a huge process. And Ralfy has some good commentary on that, and talks about, distilleries that are doing it right. And he talks about Kilkerran and how, everyone is loving what the stuff they're bringing out right now. And talks a little bit in the industry on, what it costs to get a distillery going, and the cost of stills and all of that. So really good insight in our next clip coming up.
I tell you, nothing motivates you to buy better whiskey than after you've bought a disappointing bottle, particularly when you've overpaid for it. It is the best lesson you can learn in negative returns. And what you want to do over time and experience, and this is the great thing about the internet, is by looking at various hubs, ports and channels and various, having your personal contacts and Twitter and Zoom and all the rest of it, you get consensus. And the consensus helps you to steer away from the bad buys and to be first to discover something that's appeared in the horizon that other folk maybe haven't particularly latched onto yet. And a classic example of that is Kilkerran from Glengyle Distillery. Everybody's absolutely toasting to the 10s. The 8-year-old cask strength Kilkerran, followed closely by the 12-year-old. And I can remember when I was down in Campbelltown at the time, when they actually opened the distillery for the opening day, because it was a great opportunity it's a lovely run, from Glasgow down the west coast to Campbelltown. But I was really curious to see how they had bedded in their stills. Now, something that many people don't realize was they bought the stills at Glengyle Distilleries, a pair of stills, relatively small. They bought them second hand. They weren't made to order by Forsyths, because Forsyths, who more or less monopolize Scotch whisky pot stills, are very, very expensive. Now, they're the best at what they do, but they're super expensive. If you want a fleet of stills into your distillery, you're looking well over £1 million.
Wow.
That's what $1,300,000
American. Yeah.
They're super expensive.
Yeah, that's probably about 1.8 Canadian.
8 million, is it?
Canadian dollars for sure. Yeah.
All right, in this next clip, we get into talking about Aaron and what they're doing as far as label transparency. We talk about Springbank and their integrity bottlings and Ralfy's view on age statements and stuff like that. So it's a good time to talk about what we're drinking right now. So on the nose on this thing, it's really that heavy sherry that you'd expect in the sherry bomb. Those red fruits, the figs, the raisins, the dates. A little chocolate in there.
Yeah. I mean, it's cask strength, so you would expect some heat, and it's not the oldest whiskey either. So obviously there's that. But really nice nose. For me, it's not one of those, the nose is not the highlight of this whiskey. I think the palate outshines the nose.
Mm.
But nice nosing whiskey for sure.
I get a really nice cherry pie filling note on it. And the palate, you do get just a touch of that like youthful alcoholic note, but you get lots of like chocolate, the fudge, the figs, dates all come through.
Yeah. I think your cherry pie note definitely carries through on the palate as well. Finish of a nice like cinnamon or something like that, maybe nutmeg, something of that sort.
A little spice in there. I get a little bit of nuttiness, and you like a little like roasted chestnut note as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, pretty impressive. Really nice, good whiskey. You remember what we paid for this?
It's up $100, I believe. I want to say that I paid close to like $90 for this, maybe a little
Canadian.
bit.
Yeah. And we'll score this bad boy at the end, but pretty decent value for money, depending on where you're buying it, for sure. All right, so here's Ralfy's take on Aaron, label transparency, and age statements. Is this a good time to talk about the whiskey we have in front of us right now? The Aaron, it was a distillery that I admittedly like passed off until they did the rebranding. They rebranded the 18-year-old. Rob, you got me onto it. I think they changed the maturation a little bit, right? The old Aaron 18 maybe included some more ex-bourbon cask. This one looks like it's majority sherry, if not all sherry cask.
Heavily sherried, I would think.
Really impressed. Very impressed with this, especially for the value. We paid right around 120 Canadian dollars for this bottle. I mean, you cannot go wrong with an 18-year-old, 46%, heavily sherried, lots of complexity coming out of this. I named this my pleasantly surprised whiskey of the year. Ralfy, you named the 10-year-old your whiskey of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think well deserved. I mean, there's obvious the contemporary presentation. It's very much a presentation for this moment in time, while other brands are still basically stuck in the past, bottling without tangible information. They don't mention chill filtering. They don't mention the addition of E150 colorant, despite the fact that increasingly malt whiskey drinkers are alert to it for good reason. And the distilleries that do are certainly getting more attention, getting more online time because of it. Aaron is a classic example, primarily because they've made it quite clear on the front of the label where it should be, where it needs to be in bold writing. It's not hidden away in tiny letters. Non-chill filtered and natural color. And the reason this is important is because it's like the reassurance that your bottle in the UK contains 70 centilitres of spirit. It's a precise, specific measure. It's not 65 centilitres or 50 or 40, well, depending on the bottle. Some bottlers do bottle in 50 centilitre bottles. But by law, it's 70 centilitres in the UK. By law, it's 40% volume, not 39, 38, or 37. That is clear, tangible information which is specific to the experience of smell and taste. Now, after that, an age statement. Now, we know that age statement influence will vary depending on whether it's a first fill cask, second fill cask, even a third fill cask, and the size of cask. That all matters. But to have some information, real information, is better to have none. And when distilleries are withholding useful information for their customers, one can only presume they're doing so for a reason. And that reason isn't entirely positive. Now, it's not as if we're dealing with one whiskey market anymore. Globally, there are several whiskey markets, but some distillers are still trying to bottle for one whiskey market, and that is the supermarket and travel retail and on trade in bars and hotels. And they continue good quality single malts bottled at 40%. Sure, it makes them more profit. But even at 43%, they're not losing that much in the way of profit when they can add a small premium onto the top of the bottle and basically give the customer simply a better caliber of experience. So when you look at Springbank, the reason Springbank is still regarded as Scotland's #1 distillery is because it's their in-house policy, 46% unchill filtered, natural colour, and they make this quite articulate on the back of their label. And it's throughout their range of single malts. And it's been, Aaron have latched onto this, Bruichladdich for a, you know, and when it was owned by Mark Renier, certainly latched onto that. Glencadam are into that, and so are a number of other distilleries that are aware of this. Another good example, Glenelg under Billy Walker. Mm-hmm. You know, very experienced man in the industry. He knows which way the wind's blowing, and he knows that there is this high spending, frequent spending, international group of whiskey drinkers who are right into their scene, who are really enjoying the whole community above and beyond an individual bottle, and are basically one of the reasons they're into checking the things out online and looking at reviews and all the rest of it is to significantly accelerate the learning curve as to what quality of smell and taste can feature in a bottle of spirits. They should not be ashamed of putting age statements, even younger age statements, because there's this idea in the industry, because old habits die hard, that if people see a whiskey at 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, or even 2 years, they're going to consider it not ready or too young and immature. But attitudes are changing significantly. Take Amrut from India, a beautiful whiskey. They're quite happy to put a 1 year age statement or a 2 year age statement and then quantify that by saying that it's been tropically aged. And it's the same with rum producers who say, we've got a 3 year age statement in a bottle, but 3 years in the Caribbean is 7, 8, 9 years. I'd say probably near 7 years if it happens to be a northern altitude whiskey, say from Canada or Scotland.
Correct.
So by having that level of disclosure, even if it seems to be undermining the conventionality, I think it's something that modern producers should be confident in doing, because it's open-handed and it's a sign of integrity. And I know that if you're blending, say, a 9-year-old whiskey with a 2-year-old whiskey, you don't want to be saying 2-year-old whiskey. But as far as I'm aware, there's absolutely no reason why they can't say, I mean, there's issues in Scotland, you've got to name the youngest.
Yeah.
But in other, say in Ireland, for example, although they've been kicking off about it, if you say, well, please refer to our website for age statement, you know, or if you can put it on a leaflet inside the box and say this is 20% 2-year-old and 80% 8-year-old. Enjoy. That level of disclosure is something that a new generation of significant whiskey drinkers are significant because they're spending more, buying more, and they're talking more about it. Very important growing group of customers will appreciate and latch on to, and it will improve the profile of the distillery. Because to have good quality wooden casks is a great start. But the only way to show people that you've spent that extra budget on good quality casks and made flavoursome spirit is actually in smell and taste and in the basic factual points of presentation. Volume in the bottle, strength of the alcohol, and how old it is, and a bit more about the casks. And you can leave underneath the dappled maple trees in our wild wilderness in which the wild boars and bears still roam as the lumberjacks fire up their saws in the background, etc., etc., etc. By the way.
So I thought it was really interesting that Ralfy talked about label transparency, and he does reference a point where he says, at least mention to go check out the website, find out the age statement, that sort of thing. Aaron does that with this one being 9 years old on the website, not on the bottle. I wonder why they do that. I mean, I think we're in a climate now where people would receive a 9-year-old Aaron cask strength really well, but I mean, they at least are, revealing the age statement on the website. I recently reviewed the Canadian Club 43-year-old, and from the moment they released the 40-year-old, they were very open about telling us what that lower 10% was going to be. I believe it was the 41 or 42 that had actual cognac or something of that sort in the 41 or 42-year-old whiskey. The 43 has 13-year-old rye. So there's 9.09% 13-year-old rye. And they were very open about telling people what that is. I think they should go one more and say reference our website, like Ralfy mentions, for the actual age statements instead of, because there's probably legal reasons why they can't put that on the bottle, like i.e. compass box and stuff like that. Right. So I wonder if Canadian rules and regulations are similar in that way, where they can't put it on the bottle, but they can reference it on the website. So it would be cool. And it doesn't really make sense why there's these laws against saying that there's a 2-year-old whiskey in there. Like I recently tried a Boulder 2-year-old whiskey, and I thought it was fantastic. And they say right on the bottle, this is 2-year-old whiskey, So it's the times have changed. I think they need to really alter these ancient laws.
Yeah, I agree, because it seems like distilleries are wasting time telling a story that has nothing to do with the whiskey itself, when what they should be doing is telling you exactly how they're making this and how they're blending it. And I agree, tell us, okay, this is blended between casks that are 9 years old and casks that are 15 years old. And I guess that distilleries seem like they have a fear of releasing a whiskey like this and putting a 9-year age statement on it, and then in future releases having to drop that down by a year, let's say. Yeah. So if this was 9, okay, you know what, next year we don't have enough, we got to bring it to 8. And now they have 2 whiskeys on the shelf beside each other, one with 9, one with 8, and then the same price. Why am I going to spend the money on the 8-year-old when I can buy the 9-year-old? So I think that's really the main issue with NAS and doing stuff like that. And I would just tell them to put the batches on there. Like, this is batch 1, it's 9. This is batch 2, it's 8. Start trying to make it the same whiskey every single year, because it's not going to be the same whiskey every single year. It's going to be different. I don't think there's any problem with that. So I think that's maybe the thing that is annoying. But yeah, I mean, putting an age statement on it helps your palate, and it helps your progression as a whiskey drinker too, because you can make this determination. Like, if this is this age, now I know in my mind, okay, this whiskey from this distillery at this age tastes a certain way. You kind of grow as far as your palate is concerned, and letting people know that you're blending different ages together is also another great tool in your palate development. So yeah, I think that it would be nice to see the Scotch Whisky Association move in that direction.
Yeah, I think there should be one global, set of rules, and just follow these rules, and that's it. Because I think it's getting to the point where it's so hard to keep track. Like, okay, what are we drinking right now? Oh, these are the new rules, or these are the rules that I got to follow when I'm drinking Japanese whiskey or Canadian whiskey. Oh, American whiskey can have 1-month-old whiskey in it. Okay, like I don't know, just getting a little crazy.
It is. In this next clip, Ralfy talks about his second book, which is available now. It's called Stories from a Whiskey Bar. It's available on Amazon. His follow-up to his first book, Search for a Whiskey Bothy. So you can check those out. We'll link to them in the description here. Really cool story that he talks about in his newest book about Indigenous brewers and kind of how the term hooch was kind of coined. And he talked about how a beer actually saved people's lives back in the day. So really interesting story that Ralfy talks about here.
Giving us a very short, quick plug. Oh, it's gone. My first book, I was really delighted how well it sold, because it was my first shot at writing a book, and it wasn't well edited and it wasn't particularly well formatted. But I couldn't go through a traditional publisher because they're never going to be interested by someone as offbeat as myself. You know, I'm not the right sort in that respect. I am not a conventional whiskey expert, but it's sold really well, and it's primarily by word of mouth, and been selling online, partly, I think, due to the global lockdown. So I really, really appreciate it. And the only reason I wrote the first book was because I happened to mention it's my 10th anniversary coming up as a whiskey reviewer. You know, maybe I should write a book. And then, of course, the comments came back, oh, if you wrote a book, I'd buy it. And I thought, well, you know, I've never written a book. Here's a good and valid reason. So I kept it really, really simple. My first 2 attempts, I was writing too much a conventional book, you know, books that are already written and out there and done a hell of a lot better by other writers. So I just basically went for a chronological timeline of how I first tasted whiskey, and how I first got into whiskey moving into Glasgow and joined Glasgow's Whiskey Club and was buying whiskey in shop. That sort of kind of timeline stuff. And it's been very well received. So it prompted me to write a second book, which included material which I'd been thinking about in the first book, but of course I didn't want to make it too long. So the second book is a collection of short stories called Stories from a Whiskey Bar. And it's basically been sitting in a bar with a pint and a chaser, usually brewing a Haben 12-year-old back in the 1990s when nobody else had heard of it. But the shipping people, the folk in the tugs and the maritime folk down at the Clyde, that tended to be the single malt they went for because it was accessible and affordable. So that's where you picked up stories. You know, someone would have a few drinks and they say, oh, did you? I'll tell you about this. And they were just fantastic because it told you about in the shortly after the war, when the bars were basically, you know, people were turning a bit extra money, doing some hooching at home and just kind of smuggling into the local bar, and it was getting mixed in with the commercial stuff. And these things happened then, and how, you know, workers in distilleries who were very, very poorly paid and unmotivated, you know, it's the only job they could get. So they'd be paid in liquor. So by the time they got midweek, they were starting to get pished and they never sobered up to the weekend. So this is all real. So I've taken a selection of 11 different stories, including some of my own experiences surfing up in Lewis and having a near-death experience and going out to Bonneville and getting a world land speed record. And I've included that in with a fairly accurate historical story done in the style of Robert Louis Stevenson of an illicit distiller up in Loch Lomond. And this is actually based on historical evidence, closely in historical evidence, and also on the disasters of a Clyde Coast puffer, which goes on a journey, and frequently puffers, because they had a low draft, so they could get into the dockside at distilleries in Islay at low tide as well as high tide. And they were only craft available, and they'd transport barrels of whiskey from Islay over to Glasgow for bottling. And it's just a fascinating heritage, which it never really gets mentioned now, but I've included it in my book. But in the first chapter, I go to the Isle of Bute off the west coast of Scotland, and we join a group of amateur liquor makers. Now, bear in mind that making whiskey is illegal in Scotland. Distilling is illegal. Homebrew is fine. You can ferment all you want, but you can't distill. So they formed a camaraderie and a wee group of pals who would basically block off the lane to their wee hut, their wee cottage, and they'd have a weekend party, which was fueled by what they were making in the cottage and the kitchen stove. And what triggered this was that in the early days of the Canadian frontier, a lot of trappers and traders found it easier, particularly up the western seaboard, to travel by boat up the coast, hugging the coast, rather than trying to go through land, which still had lots of, there was the problems with hostile indigenous people. Wolves were a very real risk, and bears. And of course, the fact that traders just weren't used to that terrain, and particularly in winter, it was impassable. So they would go by coast on boats. And just north of Vancouver, a couple of 100 miles up the coast from Vancouver, you have an island called Admiralty Island. And it was home to a group, an indigenous community who were famed locally for being great brewers of beer. Now, they were brewing beer not just to get drunk, which is very nice, but at this point, scurvy was a very real issue during winter times when people had no access to vitamin C. Now, the indigenous people knew that you could get vitamin C in some quantity and quality from barks of trees and pine needles, but it's not something you would eat in a stew. So they knew how to transpose these pine needles as flavorings along with the bark into beer using local wild grains and domesticated grains. So they prided themselves on the quality of their nutritious beer, which the traders needed for the vitamin C, because they knew that beer from that island stopped scurvy. And there was not very quickly, the trader would turn up with a small copper pot still and show the locals how to distill the beer, which of course they loved. And they were producing some really good quality liquor. And the name of the tribe was the Hootchinoos. And this is where the word hooch comes from, and hooching comes from this Admiralty Island group of indigenous people, tribe called the Hootchinoos, who were the great pioneers of hooching. And the name stuck. And it's traveled. You get hoochers right down through Canada, right down to Mexico. But you very rarely hear the word hooching used in Europe and other parts of the world. Basically, I think the word you're a runner would be the word that's used in European context and British context, because of a lot of the illegal distillers, as you would call them now, hoochers. So they wouldn't use that word then. They had to have stout, heavy books like the bootleggers, because they needed to be able to run away fast and dismantle a still and escape fast from whoever was pursuing them, usually in horseback. So it was a different name, but I was doing my wee research and I thought, right, my little band of hoochers on the Isle of Bute are going to be called the Hootchinoos, in tribute to the indigenous people of Admiralty Island. And I think that's quite fitting. It's a lovely little story. It's the first one I wrote for the new book.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, they're in the US they call them bootleggers, and there's a great show. I forget what network it's on, but yeah, back county, bushwhacking bootleggers. Very
that has a Canadian connection as well, the bootleggers. So
yeah.
It seems like Canada is more involved in the spirits industry than we know.
All right, in this next segment, we kind of just give our appreciation for Ralfy and his ability to kind of just press play on his camera and just talk for 20, 25 minutes or so and do an entire review. No editing. Ralfy has this very unique gift of storytelling and his ability to run through an entire review, start to finish, with no takes. Really kind of admire that about him. I think both of us do, and that's why I think his reviews are so genuine and really interesting to listen to. And in this clip, he kind of talks about, how he kind of started practicing just shooting the shit with guys at the pub, and his storytelling ability kind of grew from there.
I tried to I want to say I tried to model my channel as closely to yours as I could, and I realized that being late to the game wasn't going to allow for that. I mean, there's other factors, of course, quality of the reviews and stuff like that, that you were putting out, your articulation of things and such, that that would separate you from other people trying to do what you do. But I definitely felt that I needed to up my quality of video in order to stand with some of the YouTubers that are out there, whereas you stand alone on just quality of your review. So
I'm leaning on it because the amount of time it takes to edit a video, even when you're experienced, right from the word start, it was one take and that's it. And sure, there've been bloopers and there've been misrepresentations at times, but people know to expect that. It's just part of the scenery. So people accept it. Mm-hmm. So I can literally, I've got 3 videos to record a week. I've got a review of a spirit, I've got the extras, and then I've got the Pack Pals video. So that's basically, occasionally I'll do a private video. I've just done one recently for the successful bidder of a bottle of Daffmill with my name on it, the Ralfy.com and Good Spirits Company Daffmill, which is going to go into auction in Scotland on the 1st of February to raise money for a food bank in Glasgow.
Nice.
So we're hoping to get a good sum for that. So I will be mentioning that shortly. That's kind of off the record at the moment. I'll be announcing that in the next week or so, nice. On the 1st of February probably, and doing a wee bit of Twitter feed, Instagram on it. But that's all done in an hour.
Yeah.
The whole thing, because I don't want to be burning a whole load of coal in the bothy. I've got to travel out to the bothy. It's kind of out of the way. It doesn't even have, it doesn't have an internet signal or anything. But it's just kind of a traditional, what they call a tholtad, which is a small single-room cottage that's kind of a bit apart. And it was just the ideal environment because it looks like some old button Ben up in the Highlands or a really rustic pub where if you walk in, there's the bunnety old geezer in the corner that's seen it all, done a bit. And that will just be, it doesn't care where you're at. He'll just be honest with you. So it's by default, by accident, it's really just evolved that way. And it still works after 11 years. I'm up to about 140 odd thousand subscribers and 4.5 million views a year, which is really nice.
Absolutely.
And I really appreciate it because it's just kind of opened up things in a really interesting way, because I've not just jumped into the party scene in the whiskey industry where you get invited to Edinburgh Castle and you get 40-year-old this whiskey, 50-year-old that, and everybody gets pished under the watchful eye of the keepers of the quaich.
Yeah.
And who then appraise them as to their suitability. I'll never be part of that scene because I don't need to.
I think like one thing that we definitely admire about your channel, and that I think everyone else does too, is just your ability to storytell and just press record and do 20 minutes. Me and Rob, we edit our videos for a good reason. So yeah, that's like, I love that about your channel, and I think it comes off as being super genuine, and I think that's what a lot of people like about it as well. Plus all your knowledge. I mean, of course, the knowledge is unmatched for sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, but this is simply because it's been a very, very long apprenticeship of sitting in pubs, drinking good beer and having a chats and a cigarette back in the late 1980s, right through the 1990s and well into the 2000s until I moved to the Isle of Man in 2010. So in fact, let me see, you're talking about 40 years now. The pubs with the better beer also had the better malts, which tended to attract the lorry drivers, the cleaners, the workers in the whiskey industry. Right. They were just sitting there all together having a huddle and a gossip and a bitch about the people.
Conversation. Yeah.
And then I'd turn up. So that's really where I learned my bread and butter. Mm-hmm. And then just a self-imposed apprenticeship, which was greatly amplified because when I joined Glasgow's Whisky Club, it had not long started. There was no whisky clubs. And of course, the whisky industry were really curious about, well, who's in this whisky club? Right, you've got this journalist, you've got someone who works in the whisky industry, you've got someone that works in the Scottish Parliament, hang about, you've got some well-placed people here, and there's some bunnety geezer that's doing this online thing, and my goodness, he's got a bit of an audience, so we want to connect with this whisky club. So they came along and they gave their presentation with some fabulous whiskies.
So in this next clip, we thought it was pretty hilarious. Ralfy tells a story about Little Mill using actual soap. So getting out a cheese grater and grating soap into the washback to prevent overflow and these other things. But the result of which was either a Little Mill that people absolutely adored or a Little Mill that people dreaded. It was, as he stated, excellent or horrible, depending on, I guess, maybe how much soap you got in it. Because we've tasted soap in whiskey before and not thought that there was actual soap in it. And it sometimes enhances the flavor, right? You enjoy that kind of note sometimes. Yeah. I guess Klein Leash is actually a good example of something like that. You get a little bit of like a soapy note.
Right.
So this is really cool. I think Ralfy tells it a lot better than I just did. So let's see what he has to say.
In the old days, when they were not sober producing whiskey, there's a story about Little Mill. Little Mill was a very characterful little distillery. It was regarded actually as the oldest distillery in Scotland, genuine. It's now a block of flats. It's completely demolished. But old little mills still crop up now and again, and they could either be horrible or fantastic. Very light lowland style of whiskey, lowland region, just south of Glengoyne. And the workers there, very poorly paid. They would be drunk at work, and they'd be putting on the ferment for the weekend because it would be running 48-hour ferment. Depending if it was colder, it was a slower ferment. Simple as that. So they'd be getting kind of pished, and they'd start the ferment by pouring the yeast into the washback, and they'd leave it, and they'd pop in over the weekend to check. And of course, if they'd put too much in, it would all soap up and it would be overflowing and making a mess, because that's what yeast does. If you add too much yeast, it's too active, too aggressive. This is why they put swishers in to cut back the foam. But in those days, they didn't have them, so it would overflow. And so to cut back on the sapones or the soapiness and stop the foaming, they would get out a cheese grater and a block of soap, and they would grate soap into the washback.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Now, see, in a blend, the malt would be lost in a blend. Nobody would notice the soapiness of the malt, but some independent malt bottlings of Little Mill in the old days were incredibly soapy, but it actually worked. you know, I'm getting a touch of soap in this malt, but it's still delicious. And my goodness, where's that carbolic note coming from? It's coming from the soap.
All right, so before we play just the last little tidbit of the Ralfy podcast, we'll review this bad boy, give it a score. Rob, you want to go first? I've reviewed this before.
So I did add some water. I did notice that it would help. You get a little bit more cherry on the nose, a little less on the chocolate side, a little bit more on the fruit side, but there is a nice like nuttiness. It's almost like a Brazil kind of nut that I'm getting.
Yep.
On the nose. And then on the palate, again, that cherry note, some other types of fruits, maybe like a touch of like tangerine or something citrus. And then, like I said before, with water, it actually enhances it a little bit more. It's like more of a cinnamon, a soft cinnamon kind of spice.
Yeah, I completely agree. I get a little bit of like orange peel. Definitely get like that orange kind of citrus on the finish. It goes along with the chocolate really well. I like that chocolate orange, the Christmas time chocolate orange you get. Really nice note on the finish on this for sure. So yeah, what are you scoring it?
Yeah, you know what? I think this is probably an 87. I don't know if it's a fair mark, to be completely honest, because I'm not very far down the bottle. Although it has sat for a while, I only took probably 1 dram out of this when I first popped it. Do I think that there's better no age statement or 9-year-old cask strength sherry bombs out there? Maybe, but this is very good. And for less than $100, I'd buy this again for sure.
Yeah, this one I've had open for a decent amount of time. Like I said, I reviewed this compared to the 18. This is a very solid 86 for me. And I think for the value, I'd pump it up a half mark to make it 86.5. I think it's great stuff. Really delicious. Love the notes. My only complaint would be there's just a little bit of alcohol bite. But honestly, it doesn't take away too much from it. I think it's a very, very good whiskey.
Yeah, I agree for sure.
All right, so we'll leave you with the last little goodbyes from Ralfy. We had an absolute blast, and it was a pure honor for us to have this man on our podcast, and hope you guys enjoy the content.
Hopefully we will have him again soon.
That'd be great. All right, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure,
awesome.
Ralfy. Again, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
That was incredible. You have yourself a good night, and like I said, if you ever need anything, please do not be afraid to reach out. We will definitely help you out with it, whatever you need.
Well, good luck to you both. And perhaps sometime a year down the line, we will have a wee catch up. It's gone very well. I'm very happy my end with it. I know I tend to be a bit long-winded, but that's what you get. And just keep up the good work, guys, and stay true to yourself. Know that I can see you're growing. Be confident in your own authority, and just do what you're doing the way you do it, because the hardest thing for other reviewers to fake is or imitate is personality, and you know, you both work very well together. You've got a good rapport.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate that. I appreciate that, Ralfy. Thank you very much.
Okay. Is that us over and out then?
All right, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Yes.